Hi, welcome to Women in Tech and how we can improve this field in the industry. We want this to be a panel that emphasizes discussion and audience participation. So we really encourage you to do that at all points along the way while we're in here. Ask questions, raise your hand. We'll try to call on you as soon as we can. If we're not looking at you and you really need it, like you can stand up and then we'll probably notice. But I'm Julia, and I do human resources for Last Call Media in Northampton, and am on this panel.
Hi, I'm Kelly McCabe, and I'm a developer at Last Call Media, and I am also on this panel.
I'm Johanna Bates. I am a front-end Drupal developer for nonprofits with DevCollaborative, which is a collaborative team that I co-run with my business wife who's sitting over there, Erin. And I came into this field by accident because I majored in religion, and that was 1999 when I started as a developer instead of starting in religion. And I'm also on this panel.
I'm Nicole Noll. I'm the co-founder of the Women's Coding Collective. I also teach in the psychology department at Harvard. I'm here, obviously.
I'm Victoria Chapman. I'm also known as Vicky. I'm a front-end developer and occasional designer at Common Media. I had my first job doing web stuff in 2000. I was a student designer and developer at UConn. And I made my first website in 97. I had all sorts of dorky things on it that 15-year-olds do.
And yeah, I'm just going to quickly go over how this session's going to work. We are going to start off with Nicole, and she's going to give a presentation. We're going to mostly be focusing on some of the more subtle ways that gender bias and race and class bias as well. We don't mean to make them secondary. We were just trying to speak from a place of experience here, but play out in the workplace so that we can sort of look at ways that we can make little adjustments in the everyday things we do. We want people to really know that this is really, these are things we all do, men and women alike. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So Nicole's going to give a presentation, and then we're going to do some skits, which, sorry, are going to be like a little wacky, and you just bear with us. And to just sort of illustrate a couple things, and we're going to kind of talk about them. And then we're going to really open it up for discussion. And we want, you guys to feel like you come away with some good things to try, or some resources, or some networking, or whatever you want from this session. So we don't want to just be talking heads. So I'll stop talking. Nicole.
Can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yes.
Hey, Sharon, could you get Nick? Because we're still getting mic feedback. So just ignore it while we fix that.
Sure. So hi again. Like I said, I'm Nicole Noll, co-founder of the Women's Coding Collective. I'm also a social psychologist. I have my PhD in social psychology. I've been teaching in the Harvard psychology department for the past 3 years. And one of the first questions that I'm often asked when I tell people I'm a psychologist is like, oh, are you analyzing me right now? So no, I'm not. The way I typically respond to that is that I'm not that kind of psychologist. Does anybody know the difference between a social psychologist and a clinician? Okay. Yeah. Do you want to elaborate?
No.
Oh.
That's if I knew the difference.
Okay. So basically, whereas a clinician is interested in people and kind of what makes them tick in their particular ways, I'm interested in analyzing situations and what kinds of factors we can identify about situations where all different kinds of people are going to tend to behave in very similar kinds of ways, and articulating what is at work in those situations that's kind of interacting with our human psychology to make that happen, right? So social cognition is kind of the lens through which I approach trying to understand human psychology. And what that basically means is the first question that I ask when I'm looking at some kind of situation is what is kind of the mental process at work that you can kind of point to and help you understand the behavior that's going on, right? And that's kind of what I'm hoping to contribute to our time here together. So when I introduced myself at first, I didn't really say much about how I got into technology. It's fairly recent, in the past 3 years. So in kind of getting rolling with the Women's Coding Collective, I learned a bit about coding. I really came to that project through my background in women's studies, and from a very academic background, and was interested in understanding, what we can do on the ground to try to address the gender gap in technology. So, what's the vocal situation at this point? The audio, are we good?
And we're just
Hear okay?
All right, okay.
doing the best we can with what we
So
got.
they said sort of back there. I'm gonna, yeah. It's because they're recording it for Amherst Media is for yeah stuff. Yeah. Okay. Local stuff.
If that's what's doing it.
It's possible.
We're doing all this adjustment on these, but it's actually that one's causing.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so before we get too far into this, I want to just take a moment and acknowledge kind of the inherent awkwardness of what we're going to cover here today, particularly in this group, right? Anytime you start talking about how there are systemic differences in how members of different groups are treated, that is awkward for everybody, right? It's awkward for the group that's got higher status and power, and it's awkward for those of us who have less status and power. And what I would encourage you to think about is that these conversations are really important. And if we're going to move them forward, we kind of have to have them, and we have to be willing to be in that uncomfortable space. So, if you're feeling uncomfortable at any point in this discussion, I would just, as much as you can, just try and sit with that and bookmark it for later to think about why that might be happening, as a way of understanding a little bit better what's going on. So what we're hoping to do is, by coming to understand some of the issues that are facing women and other underrepresented minorities in the tech field, and also a little bit about human psychology works, that it helps to create in some cases, and contributes to these issues. That if we understand that, it'll help diffuse that and help us understand how to unpack it and address it. So we saw a little bit in the opening keynote about some of the stats about women in technology and also other minorities in technology. So a little bit of this is a review. But you can kind of see the breakdown of what percentage of the professional occupations in the US are held by women versus what percentage within the tech sector are held by women. And then looking at the number of CS degree recipients, you can see that we actually went backwards there for a bit, right? So in 1985, the percent of undergraduate degree recipients who were women was greater than 50%, right? And in 85, when you look at computer information systems, it was about 35%. And a couple years ago, it was down to 18. Okay, so it went in the wrong direction, is my point. So in thinking about are there any changes on the horizon, right? So if you look at who takes the various kinds of AP tests, more than 50% of the people who take an AP test are female. And even when you look at it, something like calculus, right? So we've got the stereotype about women not being good at or liking math. Even still, you've got 46% of people taking the AP calculus test who are women. But when you look at the AP computer science test, it goes down to 19%. And when you start breaking that down by ethnic minorities, it gets really disconcerting. So if you look at that as kind of a projection, it's not looking too awesome. And just to reiterate, right, so as a reminder, 26% of the computing workforce is women. And when you start looking at racial minorities, like African American women make up only 3% of that. Asian or Asian American women, only 5%, and Hispanic women, only 2%. So if you weren't overly familiar with these numbers prior to this point, like hopefully this kind of gives you an overview that we have a situation on our hands that we should address. Yeah.
Can I ask you where you got your statistics?
This comes from the National Committee on Women in Technology. So they've compiled resources from like the census and a lot of various things. We have a handout actually from where the numbers come from.
It's on paper.
This material thing that you can hold and touch. Are there any other questions at this point? Okay. So I wanted to talk first a little bit about groups. So one of the things that happens in any group is that normative attitudes and behaviors are formed, right? So social psychologists do this in the lab all the time. We take people who don't know each other and we randomly assign them on some really trivial, arbitrary thing, right? Like t-shirt color, right? Now, all the people who got assigned to the purple t-shirt, you're gonna be a group, and all the people who got assigned to a yellow t-shirt, you're gonna be a group. That's the only thing they have in common, and they know that they were randomly assigned to that. But if you put them to work together in a task, they develop a group identity, they develop a group norms, and to the extent that they continue interacting, like those things hold, right? So humans, that's what we do. We're social things. We click together. But when you've got groups that are imbalanced in their composition, the norms that develop in those groups are not surprisingly more reflective of the members that are in the majority, right? So if you've got unbalanced groups, you end up with unbalanced norms. And like I said before, when you're talking about gender, you can't not talk about status and power because those things are highly intertwined, right? So what I'd like us to think about is how, if your group is in the situation of having more status and power, you're mainly surrounded by other members of your group. That's great for you. You're kind of constantly inundated with people who think like you and like the same things that you do and share the same kinds of hobbies and similarities, that kind of stuff. This is a great spot for you as a human. Humans like to belong, so that's a very comfortable thing. So it's good for you. But to the extent that your group is not completely homogenous, it does leave you with a little bit of a difficulty in maybe trying to understand what the experience of a member of a group other than your own is like within that group of people that you're working with, right? So how many of you have ever done an exercise where you find your visual blind spot, right? You look at like the two little dots on the piece of paper, right? So for those who aren't as familiar, basically, because of the way your eye works, like the optic nerve has to leave the back of your eye at some point, and there's a hole there. There aren't any photoreceptors, so you can't get visual input, right? So you actually this is not a metaphor. This is the real blind spot, right? And yet we don't experience a hole in our vision, right? Even when you do that exercise and you can show like, oh yes, I'm focused on these two little shapes, and as I draw it towards me, one disappears. It doesn't look like there's a hole there. It just looks like the piece of paper is blank, right? And what's going on is that your mind is filling in based on the best guess it has from the information surrounding that area. So there's no information for that particular spot where the shape has disappeared, but all the paper around it is white. So what gets filled in is just like, oh yeah, we've got a piece of paper here. And you can demonstrate this in kind of interesting ways. So if you give people a grid kind of like this one, where you've got a bunch of dots that are red and you're focused on the cross and the green side, and what you're trying to do is make that yellow dot disappear. And you can't do it from the screen, but you could do it at home. In our resources list, there's a link to the website where I took this, so you can go play with your blind spot when you get home. But you'll see, if you're a nerd, which obviously I have that problem, is that when that yellow dot hits the blind spot, you see a red dot. Because the information your brain's got from the surrounding area is like, we're looking at a grid of red dots here, so my guess is a red dot. And so I guess I'm using this as an analogy of like, if you're in a group with people who are primarily like yourself, you might have a little bit of the same type of situation where, you're using information from you and people like you and just kind of, not even consciously, but just assuming that that's what the group experience is like for everyone when it doesn't really apply, right? Like, that woman in your group of mostly men is a yellow dot in this red grid. So, okay. So, anybody familiar with the implicit association test? A little bit, maybe not. Okay, one or two people. Cool. So when psychologists talk about attitudes, for a long time we talked about explicit attitudes, right? Like I give you a list of 10 questions that asks you about your self-esteem or asks you what you feel about this group or how much you like broccoli, and I measure your attitude towards those things, right? The issue with that, when you start measuring some things that become socially difficult to talk about or PC, for lack of a better term, people stop being accurate in their self-report, right? Maybe they have an attitude and they don't want to admit it. And so it really becomes a problem in terms of trying to get an accurate measure. So in the past 20 years or so, one of the things that's come up in psychology is trying to figure out how we can get at essentially the patterns of associations that are influencing people's behavior without asking them directly. And the implicit association test is one way of doing that. So what you're seeing is kind of a mock-up of this. This is a computer task. It's long and boring. You can also do this online. Boring is not the correct term. Repetitive.
Tedious.
Tedious, yes. So the idea is you've got two categories on each side of your screen, and this word in the middle represents words that will be a different set of words that is repeated, right? So this is an example from the gender science versus liberal arts attitude test. So what it's getting at is our association with science, is their connection with science and male stronger or science and female stronger? And similarly with the liberal arts, right? Do we associate women with the liberal arts and men with science or vice versa? And so what you do in this task is you see words that are associated with, having two computers is freaking me out, with these various categories, right? So you've got men and women's names, and you've got words that are associated with science and words that are associated with the liberal arts. And your task is, as these words come up, to hit the correct key as quickly as possible to categorize these words. And you're using the same key for one pair, right? And you do a whole bunch of trials of that, and then we switch it. So before we had women with liberal arts and men with science. Now we've got men with the liberal arts and women with science. And what we're essentially doing is like, are you faster in one of these blocks than the other, right? Is it easier for you to categorize these words when I'm pairing two of these sets versus the other two sets, right? So that's one of the ways that we can try and get at, okay, above and beyond what people might say or what they might believe about how women can be just as good at science as men or XYZ, whatever thing you want to measure, are there associations that we have that kind of go beyond that? And it starts to let us ask questions about, well, how might that be important? And in what kinds of situations might that be important? So hopefully that gets a little bit about what implicit associations are. So the point there is just that your brains are essentially pattern recognition devices, right? So you see things paired in the environment repeatedly, and it makes a connection between them. So again, going back to this distinction between your explicit attitude and your implicit associations, and I'm using those words deliberately, right? Like some people will refer to it as an implicit attitude, and that's not necessarily incorrect, but it is debated, right? It's more, less latent to call it an association. So we know from research that a lot of our implicit associations, essentially we pick up in our sociocultural environment, right? So there's been research done with kids in grade school, and they reflect the stereotypes in their cultures, the implicit attitudes that their parents have, that kind of thing. And you can push implicit associations around, right? So I can measure your associations with like butterflies versus moths or something, and essentially show that I can change them by pairing them with different kinds of stimuli. So what do you think about this division between implicit and explicit attitudes? It seems like a lot of people are thinking about this for the first time, and I'm curious, like, yeah.
So I can think that, if someone asks me for, they're looking for somebody for their shop, that if you think of men as the people that come to mind first, they're the ones that you recommend for special opportunities or whatever. Not because you might consciously say, oh, I don't have any bias, but if you have an implicit bias, it's just what occurs to you first.
Yep. That's a really great example. Yep.
This is reinforced using or through popular media. For example, a lot of the shows, since the time they started getting into geek-themed shows, they have the male is the geeks, and then the female is the non-geeks. Like Yaki Crowd. But have you seen anything that could help push against that?
Push against the idea that that is happening?
Yeah, or to help people to not assume that it's the situation.
So I can tell you that, so kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about how you can kind of push implicit associations around, like we know that input from the media, like you're talking about, does have that effect that you're suspecting. So one thing we could do is try to have counter stereotypical examples in the media that we consume. Please pitch that to Hollywood ASAP. So, and you see some of that, and that's great, and it'd be great to see more. But yeah, you're completely right? So when I say your sociocultural environment, I'm talking about not just what goes on in your family or your school, but also like the media that you're consuming and all of that stuff. So it's a good point. Yep.
So if an industry is male dominated, for example, the implicit bias would tend to propagate males in that industry. And so you have to make a conscious effort to interview.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That when you start trying to address these things, it kind of, so I've been talking about this as like an automatic or an outside of awareness thing. And kind of ironically, in order to address it, you have to make a conscious effort and focus on it and take deliberate steps. Yeah.
I just want to interject, Damien, because I know you have kids, right? As from a parenting standpoint, with that stuff, like the cartoons and the stuff, that even if it's really decent qualities, it still has all that stuff baked into it. Like my partner and I have really trained our kid to just notice, and we're just like, step one, notice. And I think that's true for all of us. Like step one, if you, like the things we're talking about, if you just start to notice it, it's like a huge shift right there. It seems subtle, but.
No, that's a great point. In college, I worked on a project where we looked at gender stereotypes in television commercials, and we were rating the actors in television commercials on like 70 dimensions. I never watched television the same way again. It completely ruined it for me. Not that that's a bad thing, but that definitely was the point at which it happened. Yeah. Like,
in your research, what's more powerful?
What are my options?
Associations or your explicit? Like, who's in charge?
That's a really great transition to my next slide. Thank you. So it depends a little bit on the situation and also the strength of both your explicit attitudes and your implicit associations. So you've got a lot of factors kind of going on there, right? But I can tell you that some situations in which your implicit associations are much more likely to have an influence on your behavior are situations where you need to make some kind of quick decision, or also when you're multitasking or distracted, or where there's no obvious way to check yourself, right? So an example of the quick decision is, so in the lab, we do this check for weapons bias, basically. So if you have people categorize like small objects that you can hold in your hand as either a dangerous object or not dangerous object, and you
pair them with white and black faces. When non-dangerous objects are paired with black faces, they're falsely identified more frequently as a handgun than as like the cell phone that it actually is than when they're paired with white faces, right? And so the explanation for what's going on there is essentially that because in US culture, part of the stereotype about African Americans is this concept of violence, that when you show someone an African American face, it primes that concept, right? And it has this downstream effect of making you more likely to misidentify an object as a weapon. As has been recently and repeatedly illustrated to horrid effect. So these are, obviously there are much more serious situations in which we could be talking about the effects of implicit attitudes. Aside from recent cases, there have been lots. Like every time people write about implicit attitudes, there's usually at least one case of someone being shot in error brought into the popular press article. So an example of the other kind of situation where you can't necessarily check yourself very easily, right? So if I give you a stack of resumes and say, pick out a good candidate, you have a whole bunch of them in front of you, and you can kind of, hopefully, if you're attending to these kinds of things, essentially do a conscious check of like, why do I think that this guy should be the one that I hire instead of this woman, and that kind of thing, right? But if I just send you one and say, hey, rate this, you get kind of a different outcome. So this is what Moss Rasmussen and colleagues did a couple years ago. They basically sent materials for a lab manager position to a whole bunch of scientists and asked them to rate, how likely they would be to hire this person, what their starting salary would be, how much they would be willing to mentor this person. And they randomly assigned, so people either got a packet of materials that had a masculine sounding name on it or a feminine sounding name, right? Identical materials. And what you find is that the guy was rated as more hireable. The starting salary given, the recommended starting salary given to him was several $1,000s higher than that offered to the woman on average. And the researchers were more willing to spend time mentoring the guy than the woman. And so, like Johanna said at the beginning, we all have these things that we do, right? So these are scientists. These are people who pride themselves on making decisions based on data. And with something like this, you can show that, yes, there are data there, but that doesn't mean that you can turn off your human perceptions and expectations and just, absorb them via pure osmosis. Like we always read everything through our kind of expectations and our cultural scripts and our stereotypes, right? So that's what I'm kind of pointing at when I say like a situation where you can't easily check yourself. Right? Because if you put the resume in front of them, obviously, with just the different names, they would have been like, oh, wait, I see what's going on here. I can control that. And that's great, right? So we want to be able to have that step where you can exercise conscious control. But in cases where that's not an option, you do see the effects of implicit attitudes. Other questions? Yeah.
Related to that, so I would follow up to kind of do a follow-up to see if they were presented with the other candidate, if they changed their recommendations for the first time?
No, I don't think, not to my knowledge anyway. Yep.
Is there any evidence to show that consciousness can improve implicit association? Like if people are made aware of their own biases, they go away?
Do you mean just by mere awareness? Like, so you now knowing like, oh, hey, I have implicit, or do you mean like, so that's an interesting question, right? So we know that one of the reasons psychologists get a bad rap is like we're always fooling people, right? We have this cover story that we tell you about what we're studying and then it's some other thing. Because if we told you what we were studying, sometimes that would change what would happen. Unfortunately, implicit attitudes isn't one of those things where just by making you aware of it, like it's now no longer potent in your life. That'd be
well, for at least in certain circumstances, that'd be great. But that's not the way that works out. But the kind of longer term question of, if I make this some kind of conscious priority of like, oh, I recognize that I'm using gendered language and I want to stop doing that, right? I want to substitute in firefighter for fireman or, whatever it is. It's a process, but yeah, if you attend to that and correct yourself when you do it, that definitely improves over time, right? Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah. Yeah.
Women also tend to read materials and
Yeah, so thank you for reminding me of that. That is a really important point of the study. The gender of the researcher rating the application materials was not an effect at all. So both men and women are doing this. All hope is not yet lost. I feel like it's at the point where we need to say that. All right, so we already talked about this a little bit of how you can change your implicit attitudes. And so the other point I kind of wanted to make here is the implicit associations have really long tentacles. They reach out through into everything. So the kinds of questions that you're asking and the examples that you've offered have shown some of the situations in which they arise. They influence our expectations, which influence how we act towards people. That can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So kind of like, sorry, I forget, Mike? Steve. Sorry, Steve was saying earlier, right? Like if somebody says like, oh, I need a person for my shop and only guys come to mind, like that is going to influence how you act towards those people and thus shapes. It's just a whole big feedback loop is the point. So how many, do we want to do the Verizon? So have you seen the Verizon Inspire Her Mind commercial? I think it kind of does a nice.
Has anyone seen it? Verizon is a terrible company, but they made this amazing video, and I was like, I'm so angry that Verizon made this because I think it's amazing. So apologies. Right there, and yes, and scene. All right.
Who's my pretty girl? 9, 10, 11. Sammy, sweetie, don't get your dress dirty.
Sam, honey, you don't want to mess with that. Let's put him down.
Samantha, this project has gotten out of control.
Whoa, hey, careful with that. Why don't you hand that to your brother?
Our words can have a huge impact. Isn't it time we told her she's pretty brilliant too? Encourage her love of science and technology and inspire her to change the world.
And don't buy Verizon products as a result.
Have you guys seen the Grow Like a Girl?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, the point is there's a ton, we're seeing this as a trend, or at least I've been seeing it as a trend among companies where they're starting to put out these commercials that are like, hey, maybe we shouldn't treat women as this certain thing that we've kind of boxed them into. And it's really great. And I'm so glad that this is emerging as a trend. And, companies are pointing out, like, don't throw like a girl, don't use gendered language in these patterns, like, you're a girl, you're doing this wrong,
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. Sorry, side note.
No, that's, yeah. So they're both subtly and at the same time like hitting you over the head with these kinds of examples, right? By sticking them all back to back. Yet I would be willing to wager that we all encounter at least one of these a day and we don't notice it because it's really normalized, right? There's some really fascinating research where they watched kids in a preschool and watched how the teachers interacted with them. And the patterns that they found were just kind of fascinating, right? So obviously when you're dealing with little kids like that, you're correcting them in some fashion because they're they're in training mode. But the way in which they were addressing the boys versus the girls, right? So they would say to the boys, stop doing that thing, but they would prescriptively tell the girls what to do instead. So things like that, things about like the way the kids came to school dressed, and thus the way that they were able to play in terms of, is your skirt up over your whatever, so those kinds of things. And it starts really little. So I think it's, we're having this, what feels like a huge conversation broadly about how do we get more women in STEM fields and technology specifically. And that's excellent, and we definitely need to be doing that. But we also need to be going way younger than that and thinking about, well, how are we socializing girls from day one to, it's a little late when she's picking a college major to be like, hey, how about calculus? If you bought her that T-shirt about like I'm too pretty for math or whatever that outrage was. So anyway, I have more I could say with that, but I'd like to bring some of the other stuff out in discussion. So if we want to,
we're gonna skid it up. Does anybody have any questions before we humiliate ourselves? So we're gonna do 3 really quick skits to sort of illustrate some more subtle things that happen every day. These kind of subtle things that we're talking about. And the first skit is called Looking Past. And we're gonna change gender, so we have some mustaches to help you figure out. So it's just you who's male right now.
I'm the man.
And you are the office manager, so you need to sit here. This is male office manager.
What you just saw, her pulling out my chair, is not usually how this works, actually. That's a reverse gender binary.
Why don't you? This is
I'm
Julia,
a developer.
She's a female
for
developer.
now.
She's a female developer.
Yes.
So yeah, at this moment. And then we have a client. They work together at a company. So he's the office manager. He has no computer skills at all. He can barely use Word. Okay. So yeah, I mean, which is fine. He has other skills, but yeah. So, and this is a customer of either gender who is going to be entering this business who has a serious problem with her website, and his or her or their website. Go.
Excuse me, can I talk to you about my website? It seems like it's been down for the last hour. I'm having a lot of problems. Can you help me with that?
Well, actually, I think maybe you should speak to a developer, maybe?
Oh, where's the developer?
And scene. So basically, it's very subtle, but you'll notice that, and of course we're terrible actors, but except for Victoria, who has some experience. But sorry, you guys. But the thing is that, and I've done this myself, and I'm a developer. If you walk into a room and you have a technical question, many people experience this, and you guys experience this on a daily basis.
Yeah, this one was actually taken from an example of something that I experienced working in the tech field, actually at a computer repair store. I worked with a male colleague, and we both worked the front desk. I did sometimes when I would do technical work in the back, so I was very well versed in fixing computers. And what would happen is I would be standing closer, like literally standing closer to the door where customers would enter, but they would bypass me and walk straight to him. And inevitably what would happen is if he could answer the basic questions like, why is this happening, he would. But 9 times out of 10, he would say, hey, Kelly, I don't know about this. And I would go over and help. And it would be this thing where it was like, you just walked past me and I could have saved you the time and helped you with this. So this is kind of where this one comes from, and that we see this on a pretty regular basis, especially if you're a woman in any sort of tech field. Immediately it's just assumed you don't really know what you're doing here.
Yeah, and I would add, it extends in other ways to other kinds of contexts where you're not just walking up to somebody, but people often assume I'm a front-end coder. I write code. I'm not a designer. And I can.
But you're a woman. You must be the designer.
Thank you. And I can project manage, but I married a business wife who is a professional project manager because she's stellar at it. And I don't want to project manage. I want to write code. And I've had people who want to hire me for projects try and convince me to be the project manager.
Me too.
And I'm like, why? And I figured out why, obviously. But so this just, and they were trying, they thought I was smart. They wanted to hire me. But yeah, so those are just other examples.
I think it's important to note here as well, because I kind of want to, how do we fix this situation? Okay, here's something really simple that anyone in the room can do. Next time you're at a conference like today or tomorrow, when you go up to meet someone new, if they happen to be a female, don't assume they're a project manager. Don't assume they're a designer. This has happened to me at so many web events. People come up to me and are like, oh, so you're a designer? And there was one guy, this one particular instance, he asked me 3 times if I was a designer. One of my coworkers who actually stepped out, he was here earlier, had to literally look at him and say, no, she's a badass Drupal developer. And it took a male presence to actually convince this guy that I was not a project manager or designer, which there's nothing wrong with being, by the way. I'm just saying, don't make these assumptions about women fitting these particular roles. Or if you're gonna make an assumption, walk up to them and be like, hey, you a developer? You know how to code? Flip it. Flip it and make it something different.
Yeah, and I know I've talked to men who are not coders, who are designers or who are project managers, or who are writers for the web, and they get assumed to be developers. So so just don't assume. It's one of the places where you can just cognitively step in and interrupt. I don't know if you want to talk about that from a brain standpoint.
I think this level is fine.
Okay.
We don't need brains.
I want some neuron talk. All right.
Executive function.
And while I do have design experience, I also, at this point, I primarily am a developer, and I've made a transition from design to development. But same thing. People assume that I don't know how to do that sometimes. And more than once, I've been told, you should be a project manager instead, because you're good with people and you understand their feelings. And that's great. I do have those skills, but I don't want to. I want to sit at my computer and write code.
Me too.
So, yeah.
I think a lot of your problem is most people, maybe it's because I'm blind and I don't see, but the way you're talking is most people are assuming by how you present yourself within an environment. So in the previous life, I was an anthropologist. The opposite was a psychologist. They don't like us either. But it's how you are perceiving how they think. A lot of people don't know the difference between a designer and a developer.
But there are points where it's more obvious that,
Right.
they're being pretty clear about what they think. And
All right, but a lot of people don't know the difference, and they are assuming that a developer and a designer is higher than a developer. So maybe they're giving you a compliment. You have to perceive where they're coming from. My grandfather was one of the biggest chauvinists that has ever been. But when it came time to going out to dig the trenches, to clean up the septic system or something or other like that, he had to use women because he had 1 grandson to 15 granddaughters. And cheap help is using your grandchildren. So he found out the grandson couldn't dig worth a dam, and so he was sent off, and myself and my other cousins wound up digging the ditches. It wasn't because he was being chauvinistic, he just recognized that my brother couldn't dig. And he still can't dig.
Right.
But that was just an economic belief on it. We've got to remember that up until 100 years ago, women were not given a lot. I had an aunt that was a suffragette. She fought for the vote. And to her, it was very important to line up all us women to make sure we went and voted, and that we voted at every one. And she did all sorts of crazy things like run her jackass for the treasurer of the town we lived in. And it won because it ran on the Republican ticket. And things like that to prove things to us women that we shouldn't be voting according to parties and things like that. That is a lot of things that change how people look.
I would agree with you that how people are perceiving you in a situation matters, but I would expect that if people are just looking at you and not really knowing the difference between those two roles, they should have an equal chance or an equal likelihood of mistaking a woman for a developer as a designer. And I would argue that the pattern of so frequently mistaking women for designers instead of developers suggests that there's some underlying assumption about who's more likely to be one or the other. Does that make sense?
We have,
Yeah.
we have a couple.
There's one over there.
Steve and then Meg. Yes.
So I saw something recently that I hadn't really appreciated before, which suggested that people tend to look at women as something that needs to be controlled by a man. And so, a man will hit on women that he sees as being unaligned with women that he sees as being unaligned with a man. But if they're together with a man, they won't hit on her because she's already being controlled by a man. But I think the same sort of thing is also true in the workplace, that people have a tendency to go in and talk to the man because they're obviously the one that's in authority, and it's only after they've been directed to talk to a woman that they will. And it's part of this, women as being, assigned to a man and controlled by a man as an implicit bias.
Meg?
Well, then there's the fact that the word computer ahead of all of those. Like within the microcosm of geekdom, you get the nuances. But in the outside world, it's all computer fill in the blank. And computer goes with guys.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah, right.
so if you walk into something that says computer on the top, and your implicit assumption is that men need computers, that's what you're going to look for, regardless of whether you understand the nuances within.
Should we go to the next? We're going to go to the next skit, which is called Unwanted Shoulder Rub. Julia, can you swap back? Thanks. Julia is a female developer, and she's working really hard on a project. She's got a site launch. She's super stressed out. She's like due tomorrow. It was due yesterday. She's really stressed out. I am going to be her male colleague, and I just want to say that I'm doing this because this happened to me yesterday at this conference. I'll talk more about that in a second. That's my message. Oh, hi. Hey, Jules. Oh man, you're almost done. That's great. Yeah.
Got some ways to go though.
Yeah, you look really stressed.
Oh.
Yeah, you need a background. You probably need a background. Yeah. Can I get you some water or something?
I would love a coffee from Tarte.
Over there?
Yeah.
Are you sure you don't?
Yeah. Thanks, coffee. Really.
And scene. All right. So someone I don't know very well, who knows me from Twitter, came up to me yesterday while I was at the registration desk, standing next to the code of conduct that we printed out at a very large size. And he was like, "How are you doing?" And I was like, "Well, I woke up at 3 a.m. Because this is a brand new conference and I'm a little stressed out and he started rubbing my back, right in the middle of my shoulder blades, not even like on the edge. And I've never touched this person before. I've never been touched by this person before. I didn't want to be touched by this person. And he didn't take any cues that it was time that I was uncomfortable. And people who observed this were like, "Why didn't you smack him?" And the reason I didn't smack him, and I think that Nicole, with this, some brain science might be helpful here. I can tell you what was going on for me. What was going on for me was that I was like, I co-organized this conference, and I'm standing next to the code of conduct, and I'm in a professional setting, and is this really happening? Like, this person has offended me several times on Twitter by suggesting that technology is a meritocracy and that women aren't discriminated against. And we've had discussions, and he's been like, oh, I love having these kinds of open discussions. We should talk more. And I'm like, no answer. I'm not talking to you about the meritocracy, okay? And he responds to me on Twitter a lot without me engaging him. So it was already an awkward dynamic. And I was like, this was sort of like wouldn't it be hilarious if he came up and like touched me or something at the conference? And then it happened. So I felt like and my poor husband is like, we made fun of this man for a while before this happened. And I don't think he's a bad person at all. I think he would be horrified to know that he was this anecdote. But I felt like a deer in the headlights because I didn't know what to do. I felt paralyzed. Why did I feel paralyzed, Nicole?
Brain science.
I'd like to stick up with you, and I think that when you hit from inside and those kind of things happen and it's unexpected, and you just didn't know what to do because it's not a common occurrence. So now next time it's going to happen, you're going to speak up because now you know that's the right thing to do.
Speak up with my hand.
Somebody in the face, right? It would be saying to that person, don't touch me.
Yeah,
or
but
moving away, or hey, you know what? I got this paper here.
But I am interested. I just want to take a moment because there were some amazing terms that you used yesterday to talk about the
Cognitive load.
Yes, please go there.
So, cognitive load, everyone. So we were talking about this in prepping the session that, in these kinds of situations, or even ones that aren't as egregious, right? Where like your colleague who you don't know very well is like, oh, you look so nice today. Like those kinds of things where you could reasonably interpret it as like, oh, they're just being nice. And maybe they do just mean to be nice. But you have to keep in mind that it's one thing to have a certain set of intentions, but that doesn't mean that that's how that action or those words are received. And it's when that happens to someone, at least for me, what's going on in my head is this soundtrack of like, did I invite this? Because I don't feel like I wanted this to happen, but did I do something that made it seem okay for this to take place? And so this cognitive load idea is essentially like, flow when you get like in the zone and you're working on something and like it's just really awesome, versus when you can't really focus because you're trying to solve some other problem in the back of your mind. This experience is kind of like constantly trying to solve some problem in the back of your mind of like, why are they commenting on my clothes instead of my work? Or, what do they really think of me? Like, is this invitation to get lunch just like, hey, we're both hungry? Or is this something else? Like that kind of thing. And that gets draining. End of story.
So, first of all, I don't think anyone has any right to tell you how to react in that situation. You react how you react, and that's probably the right thing at the time. But I think there's a danger in mixing just totally inappropriate social behaviors with a larger gender issue across an industry. I certainly know that sexual harassment happens in the workplace, and it's a horrible thing, and it happens more often male on female than female on male. But it happens both ways, and I hate to take a particular incident and kind of paint the industry with that. There are systemic problems in the industry that go down to exactly what you said from kindergarten. And this is probably a small symptom of them, but there's always going to be people who act inappropriately and need to be consequenced for that. I think this type of discussion is more valuable if you kind of separate individual choice behavior, which is hugely inappropriate, versus larger kind of macro level issues.
Do you think those things can be effectively separated?
I think to a degree they can. If you're talking about wanting to bring in pro-science education for girls in elementary school, that's a different discussion than what one gentleman did. That's probably the wrong word. yesterday who's got inappropriate boundaries. I know, it's probably germane to bring it in, but at the same time, to color the discussion with one person's behavior, I think reduces a larger discussion that we need to have.
But Ash, I want to hear what Ash has to say about this.
How many women have experienced that in this room?
Yeah.
It's not one.
So I think, okay, so I wasn't trying to, I'm not trying to hate on this person. I really want, what we want to illustrate here is that there's subtle things that you could describe. As Ash said, women are leaving the tech industry. Why do they get tired? Why do they get burnt out? It's death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's like, that's one of many things that I experienced yesterday that was, yes, he did act inappropriately, but there was a cultural context that kind of made that happen. And women don't come up to me and massage me and, massage my back. Like, that hasn't happened to me. So unless they're my friends. And so I think those things for me can't be separated. And what we're trying to tease out here are the subtle things that sort of erode our energy on a daily basis. And that is an example for me.
I saw a lot of hands. Are they all responding to this point? I'm digging the discussion that's happening. Yes? Okay. Let's go gray hat, blue shirt, all the way in the back, and then Steve, now you're at the other end this time.
So I think one thing that would be important is also to paint it as that is an individual and it is systemic in the thing, but it's one thing that as a male in the industry who does feel strongly about this as well, that it isn't all of us, but it's too many of us, but it isn't all of us. So it's not the whole industry, and that I know, or I fully believe that you believe that there is hope in the males in the industry, that there are a significant number of people who do care about this and want to do the right thing, and that you're not trying to paint the entire gender as being wrong. So
We're not trying to paint. The thing I would maybe ask you to think about with that is that it's not such a neat separation of like men who care about this and men who don't. And the dichotomy of like good men who protect women from bad men is a part of this whole problem. And that good men with good intentions who are doing their best do also some of these things in the same way that, racially attentive white people do obnoxious things to black folks, right? Like just people who are in a privileged category, it is impossible to know what is not your experience on the complete level of someone for whom it is their experience.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that makes anyone a bad person. What I'm saying is I do have this hope and these expectations, and I'm demanding better, right? Like, I know we can all do better on this, and I think we all want, like, conversations around it, right?
Sorry.
I don't know if people saw the whole not all men, yes all women thing on Twitter and other internet platforms, but it was about like, not all men do this, and that's true. But the response to that was yes all women. And yes all women was about the fact that even though not all men do this, women have to live with this thing in the back of their heads all the time, and how it's just, it's a fact of life being a woman. And so it's not necessarily about like, oh, you men are all terrible, but simply by being a woman, you're confronted with these things that could possibly happen all the time.
So like Nicole was saying, there's the cognitive load of being a woman in an all-male work industry environment means that we're always multitasking. So we're always like, what does this mean? What is I'm the different one. What's going on here? And that's our experience that you can't understand because you haven't lived it. I mean, you can understand it when we talk about it. These conversations are really hard and really awkward. And we're trying to have them because if you don't have them, we're not going to get anywhere. So yeah, bring the awkward? Who else wanted to contribute to awkwardness?
So I was going to illustrate this backwards. So women always have to think about inappropriate touching that might happen. This is something that's always happening. They're always thinking about it because it could happen because men aren't labeled. Like, I'm not labeled as dangerous, even though I might be. And how many men here, when they go to a conference, worry about being inappropriately touched? That is something that you don't have to worry about. That is a cognitive load that you don't have ever.
And I worry about it I go to conferences all year long, and it's something that I'm scanning for, like I'm always scanning for, am I safe? Am I going to end up like one of those people that I've heard about who ended up going for drinks with their male colleagues and then things went wrong, not even necessarily very wrong, but like got really weird, where they felt unsafe. And it doesn't take up my whole brain. Like I'm not agoraphobic yet, but it's something that, and it's just part of being a woman and on this planet. Unfortunately, like we are like marginalized in most cultures, and it's something that we have to walk around with. Mm-hmm. So just knowing that you guys don't have those wheels turning when you're at a conference, and we do, is just like, that's awesome. If you can just like know that and just watch out. I would love it if somebody had just taken an appropriate dude aside and said, I mean, I didn't do it because I was like, I don't want to deal with you anymore. But, like a man or a woman could have taken him aside and said, hey, like, maybe you should like not do that. Like he needs help. Like somebody needs to just let him know because he doesn't have good boundaries. But he's not thinking about those dynamics, obviously.
We had up next, gentleman all the way in the back.
Another part of this is the cognitive load, and you alluded to it, of dealing with this. A few months ago, I broke my ankle. So I'm in a wheelchair for nearly 2 months. Thinking about accessibility issues, it reframes. There are a lot of conversations that I don't have to have. As a white guy, life is pretty good for me, and I don't have to have the conversation with my sons about driving while black. But having this exposure to the experience of being disabled, having to find parking places, having my wife try to figure out, okay, we get into the movie theater, how does she push my wheelchair up the ramp? All that stuff is really draining. Stuff that ought to be spent doing stuff like enjoying the movie.
Or contributing to open source code.
Could I interject with a quick point there? Right, so the work that you had to do to figure out how to do things that people who are not in a wheelchair can do without thinking about them also speaks to the systemic level of this, right? Yeah. So, we're willfully or without thinking deliberately about it, designing for certain kinds of bodies, right? And we could easily change and say, hey, we're gonna just solve this problem for everyone.
Just a footnote to that, a few years ago, we knew that we were getting on in years, and we were going to need to have a wheelchair for one of us. I didn't realize it was going to be that soon. So when we were remodeling our home, we put in 36-inch doors. We put in accessible toilets. Because when you do it up front, it's free. And similarly with some of these things, when you plan for gender equality, when you plan for racial equality, when you plan for inclusiveness, it's vanishingly close to free. But when you try to retrofit it, when you try to change behavior on the fly, when some jerk is misbehaving at a conference in the middle of a public setting, that's expensive, that's awkward, and that's really not a good way to deal with it because it becomes confrontation.
It's like retrofitting a website to become responsive.
I was just about to say that. I was like, oh man, I'm doing one of those now. Me too. Oh yeah.
right, sorry. Not that I wish ill will or injury upon any of my fellow humans, but I'm glad that you had that experience and that it made you think about accessibility and a different perspective like this, a different walk of life. It's not really real until you live it. There's no way of understanding something like the way another person lives until, it's corny, but until you walk that mile in their shoes. You have to live it to really know what it's like. So we had Steve, and then who else's hands did I see? Can we
I think
pause?
it was my mom.
Did you want to say something? Well, hold on, I'm taking an order. So it's going to be Steve, Connie, Ash, Zeke, and is there one more? Did I see? Okay.
We can always choose.
I wanted to mention very briefly that if you don't remember, President Bush was observed massaging Angela Merkel's hands on world stage.
Thanks, Steve.
This is not an issue, it's a real issue. Another point I wanted to make, which is one about nuance. So a few years ago, I was involved in a committee, and we wanted to have an open, inclusive community. And one of the people that was joining in, that was participating, was a person with mental illness. And at one point, they had kind of an episode, and they began making all kinds of threats against people and legal threats. And everyone was very uncomfortable and wanted to throw them off the committee. And someone pointed out, if you want to create an open, inclusive environment, you're going to have to accept that sometimes you're going to be uncomfortable, that people are going to do things that you don't want. And that's not to excuse their behavior or say that their behavior isn't unacceptable or to challenge the behavior when it happens, but it's to recognize that you have to have kind of a shared set of norms and understand that a diverse community isn't necessarily going to respect those, and it requires a period of adjustment to get there.
While listening to all of this, I cannot help but compare it with the way it was in the 1960s and the 1970s when you were in the work world. And I don't know if anyone here is old enough to remember Helen Gurley Brown's book, Sex and the Single Girl, which was a manual on how to use your sexuality to help your career. And it was so much worse than what you're describing. And there weren't these open discussions about it. I mean, women just bit the bullet, and an amazing number of women caved, because they wanted to work or they had to work. And so, as much as this is still an issue, and we're identifying it, it is a positive thing to remember how far we've come.
Your daughter's a web developer, Mom. We have come a long way, and we are making progress, and we're just trying to keep the hardest. We were talking about how the hardest stuff is this subtle stuff. It's and it's hard to illustrate it all because if kids are doing it before they even hit the workplace, they're in preschool. These implicit biases, associations.
Either one works.
We just recognizing them, talking about them. We're getting at it's like an onion. We're at another layer of the onion, and I want to keep peeling away at that onion because I like working in this industry most days.
These subtle things are so hard to pinpoint sometimes, and it's such an underlying thing that we're not always conscious of it. And I don't realize it, but I do things to myself even that I'm not aware that I'm doing. I'm terrible at negotiating and being aggressive because I wasn't trained that way while I was growing up.
Or imposter syndrome, self-sabotage is like psychological load that women carry. I've been with developers who are more junior to me and who are male, and they present this and there's a Clay Shirky piece on the internet, a rant about women by Clay Shirky, if you Google that, you'll find that. But how men are socialized to present themselves as totally competent. So they're applying for a job and they're like, yeah, I tried Angular yesterday and I know what I'm doing. And a woman is more likely to be honest. I tried Angular, but I don't feel real confident in it. And I don't know, I'm more just like I really care about accessibility and HTML and CSS. And, and that's a really different presentation when you're interviewing for a job or thinking about yourself for a job. So
it's not also just women tend to be more honest. I feel like that jumps a line. I feel like men feel they're being honest in that confidence.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll fake it till I make it, or I'll learn it once I get there.
The reality is women are trained that, are you sure you should do that? Are you sure you can do that? That's a phrase you hear growing up, like you have to be sure you're going to be able to do this before you do it.
Self-doubt and over-apologizing are two things.
Absolutely.
Very
And that's where a lot of that, I believe, imposter syndrome comes from. Like, I suffer from that quite a bit. There are times I'm sitting there and I'm like, I am not meant to be doing this. No one has figured out yet that I am just a big baker. And like,
meanwhile, you're launching websites. Like my partner's always like, you just launched a really awesome website. And I'm like, but I faked it. He's like, but it works really well, and it's like really nice. And I'm like, and he's like, you made a lot of money doing that. And I'm like, it's not real. He's like, well, we're spending the money.
The money's real. In the interest of time, I'm going to try to rein us in and refocus here. I think it was Ash and then Zeke, right?
I just wanted to mention something really quick. There's a really awesome blog post and kind of scientific model called the Petri multiplier, which even comes with handy animated GIFs. Very helpful. But basically, somebody modeled what sexual harassment looks like in tech. And they started with the assumption that men and women sexually harass each other with equal frequency, which is very charitable. And considering the number of people in the industry, women are still 8 times more likely to receive sexually harassing comments than men. So it's not that all men are bad. It's definitely not the case. Everybody makes mistakes. Intent isn't magic, as we like to say. The things that you do don't magically transform into how people receive the things that you do. But you have to realize the context in which marginalized people are operating through the world. So expecting that someone is going to touch you inappropriately, and how are they going to react if I smack them? How are people around me going to react when I say something and they think I'm overreacting or I'm a bitch, which are the 2 worst things you can be as women, because now you're crazy and you're angry. So that's a really dangerous situation to be in too. So that's something we are always weighing.
Would you like tweeting?
Yeah, I can take the link.
I'm curious so sometimes, I'm sure I do things that I'm unaware of that are not ideal, but I'm curious, if I witness something that someone's doing that they're unaware of, that maybe it's subtle, I'm sure there's not a right answer to this question, but I wonder what people think bystanders should do.
I think it depends on what you're comfortable with and how well you know that person. If this person's a friend of yours and you're at a social gathering together and you witness something that you're just, what are you thinking? That's the time to be like, hey, can you step outside with me for a second? And be like, dude, I don't know what was going on there, but you should know how that came off. That didn't look so good.
I think it's also important, if you're not comfortable confronting them, one of the best things I've found, don't react to it. Don't do the nervous smile or giggle at their little joke at a woman's expense. You just literally stare at them. And it's really intimidating when someone says something that's borderline and you don't give them a positive reaction. It gets really awkward for them really fast, and they think the next time before they say things like that.
It's
and
a
that
critique by non-validation.
And it's not like they're gonna go to their boss and be like, this person stared at me when I told a joke.
He did not
and I am unhappy.
Make Steve laugh at my joke.
That's a good transition to our
the next
skit.
session?
Yeah. We're gonna do one more skit just so we don't turn into zombies. And then we literally can discuss for the rest of the time, and and we have plenty of time, so it's no problem. Is that okay with the person who had his hand up? Thank you. Okay. Because we like to, obviously like to act. Who's male? No, we're not. No, I'm a female, and Victoria is a female developer. We are all developers working together in an office, and this is our office over here. This is a higher rent area than you might think. You're from the metropolitan area. So we're going to be in this small cubicle space here, working. And
I'm so glad my desk doesn't actually.
and let's see, who's walking in? Oh yeah, you're female, Victoria, and wait, who needs it? You need a mustache. You need a mustache. Here, you have to type. You know.
Yeah, I mean both.
So and then yeah, okay. So we're just a mixed group here of developers, but Victoria, I think you're supposed to be in here already, Kelly.
It says that I'm walking in.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Victoria, come sit. Victoria, get to work. What the heck? Okay, so we're all colleagues. We're sitting here. This is a really nice. This is unrepresentative because we're all women except for him. And and we're working. Okay.
Hey, you look good today. Did you get a new blouse?
Yeah, like a week ago.
It looks really nice. It really comes out the frame. You look good.
Thanks.
Man, my sister could have worked cleaner for me.
And scene. So yeah, well, it's hard to act, but
Don't judge us on our acting abilities.
Easier to make websites. So basically, the point of that was that small comments can make a big difference, and those are just like, and we tried to find more subtle things than that, but it's hard to come up with them in the moment, like when you're trying to recall them, because they're subtle. But you know, like so let's talk about a couple things that happened. You know, Victoria was complimented on her blouse, right? Now, that's nice. Like, coworker compliments you on your new blouse. Like, what's wrong with that, right? I mean, I do that. And frankly, I have questions about whether that's okay. But I compliment my female coworkers on their new blouse. I try and compliment male coworkers. Well, that's mostly my husband on his T-shirt collection. So you know, what was wrong with that? Something wrong with that, you guys? Ash.
Context. So the difference between saying, I like your shirt, and I don't know, it's so subtle. I like your shirt, is that a new shirt? And making gestures or looking too long at someone, or the difference between, for instance, I went to play, and the person who was checking people in with their tickets called me sweetie, and my male partner behind me just said, thank you, sir. Like, the familiarity. For somebody that I don't know their name, they don't know my name, but that they have kind of, you know, pushed into a boundary that I reserve for for my intimate partner to call me pet names, is something that is subtle and a lot of people won't notice. But why are you using pet names with your female colleagues and not your male colleagues? Like, if you want to call your male colleagues sweetie, like, start then. I've not seen it.
Can you talk about the experience with the client?
Oh,
it was you, right?
Yeah.
No, yeah.
I was working on a project, and the first day we had to have a face-to-face meeting, me and my project manager, with the client. So we go and we visit the client, and it happened to be in his house. He had a recent injury. So we're already in a very different environment than most people are going to be experiencing in a work situation, but there was extenuating circumstances. So we go to this meeting, and the first comments he makes about me are all based on my appearance, all of them. He's just like, he would say like, oh, it's really good. Like, he'd be like, oh, I'd really like to do video calls when we're setting up how we're gonna do meetings. I'd really like to do video calls just so I can see Kelly. He would make comments about me being a pretty girl working in the tech industry. And aside from the very personal fact that I like to think I put effort in being as non-pretty as possible, like, I put effort into being as plain looking as I possibly can, which sucks. You know, I'd love to be able to express myself. Anyway, moving on. Throughout the phone calls, we decided to just do regular voice calls. He would say, why didn't Kelly speak so much? I'd love to have heard her voice. And it just got to this point, and I didn't know who to talk to about it. I did not know if it was appropriate for me to not, like, to say something to this guy about how uncomfortable that makes me feel, because I'm a professional. I am not just a thing that's there, and him using third-person pronouns with me, calling me Kelly, never saying, oh, I'd like to hear your voice. Him addressing me as I wasn't even there was also really...
And all about your appearance. And all about your appearance, your aesthetics.
Yeah.
All about...
It's very uncomfortable. And like that, I want to bring this up, that it's not just people you're working with. This is happening with clients. This is, and I didn't know who to turn to. I talked to our admin assistant about this because I did not know who to turn to, and I did not want to get in trouble for saying anything.
Did your program manager say?
Yes. When I talked to my project manager about it, he made sure to bring it up with the client.
You should have brought it up right then.
Yeah. I think the reality is it's so common that nobody knows that it's offensive to women in some context, in the professional context, to just be like looked at as just this pretty thing sitting there.
They may not have been aware that it was a problem for you, because if your project manager is a man, he might not have had that same thought process, like we talked about the cognitive load.
Yeah, in that case, I'm very fortunate in having the team that I work with be very supportive in their reaction to that. And I never got in trouble for being offended for this, thank God, and it was totally fine. But yeah, that's the thing. Why would I? Why do I feel like I would?
But it can be felt like she would. That was important. That's just important to know, because it made her feel stressed out about addressing it.
I've gotten in trouble. It can be tough to feel out a situation with a client because this person is important to the health and continued longevity of whatever company you're working for, even if that's just yourself. So sometimes it's easier to deal with an incident that you're hoping is isolated and doesn't happen again by not reacting to it. Like, I'll just deal with this one time, it won't happen again, and then you don't know how to react. So, okay. Let's go, Steve, it's Meg, right? Steve, Meg, gentleman in the red pants, and red shirt, and then front row.
To use all to again, refer to presidents, you should remember that this time being nonpartisan, President Obama praised the looks of California Attorney General Kamala Harris about a year ago, saying that she's by far the best-looking Attorney General in the country.
You see this with politicians in the media all the time. The media will completely belittle female politicians in favor of, did you see what she was wearing?
She looks haggard.
Yeah, she looks...
Michelle Obama's arms, I mean...
It's ridiculous. So no wonder these things happen.
Right.
Okay. So at the risk of causing trouble, I have to say, I'm having this weird sensation like I'm back in time. Like I'm listening to this and I love what you're presenting. And I'm trying to figure out why this conversation is just happening in technology now. Because this is a conversation I remember having when I was asked to dance on the table as a part-time worker at the Chinese kitchen, China kitchen, I forget what it's called, in front of Stop and Shop, and had to be there. Chicken fingers, didn't want to wipe down the tables. They said, well, maybe then I could dance on them instead. Now, this was 1990. So why is this I mean, you don't have to answer this now, but I'm like, why? Is this because there's, using gross generalizations? If you are a computer geek, male or female, even now, you're one down in the school culture. As much as we want to make it cool to have geek glasses, you're still one down. And so is it because people come up from a one down place? So so I'm out as a lesbian, so does that give me greater insight into being black? Well, no, but I might think it does, and it might change, what I'm trying to do better. So I don't know if that's what it is, but I'm just stuck. To have to explain why commenting on a blouse is problematic. That's kind of where I was wait a minute, this is not. Seinfeld made fun of this.
Yeah, and I mean,
it's not a critique of you guys presenting at all. It's more just wow, this is the air I breathe.
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on. I think one, there's more women in tech. We're peeling back the onion. We're making progress. So as more women are in tech, and there's all this history of this male-dominated industry, these issues are coming up more and more. That's one thing. Also, I like this example because it is slippery slidey. Like, there are men who could compliment my blouse, and I would feel okay if I knew them really well. So this is one of those ones that it's just sort of like, if you're complimenting, and I do this for myself, oh my God, I am so bad with my friends' little girls. Like, they have children, and I'm like, oh my God, you look so cute. And I say that to little boys too. And then I have to be like, wait, I need, whoa, because they get frustrated because the first reaction they get to their little girls is, you're so cute, you're so pretty. And although I make an effort to do that to little boys as well, because my little boy is very pretty, and he's going to be doing Scratch, I think they're constantly like battling that on that front. And so I have to sort of interrupt and remember. So again, like, this is one of those things where it's just sort of like, are you always, as a woman or a man, complimenting a woman on her appearance? Like, are you doing that to men too? What is your relationship? Are you complimenting them on other dimensions of their personhood? So that's another thing. And there's a really good article on this that Nicole just found that she was gonna put somewhere for you, Meg.
I just tweeted out a link to bystander training because we aren't being, it's kind of like, well, but we aren't, I was never trained in bystander. I was trained to just ignore it and it will go away. It hasn't gone away yet. Ignoring it for a long time. But the kids in school, in Amherst schools at least, for better or for worse, are being trained in bystander training. So what do you do when you see something bad going on that you want to interrupt? And they're actually like having to actually practice it. And so there's a lot out there, and usually it's under sexual violence, but don't be scared. It's still useful skills. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be at a party where girls getting hit on, and it can just be life. And some of the stuff is really useful that you wouldn't necessarily think of, because we were all taught, at least my generation, to look away. You weren't taught to speak up.
Can I make a point related to that real quick? I feel like often one reason we don't act in those situations is we're worried how the person we're correcting or calling out is going to feel. And it's so much more salient how that action that we're going to take could have a negative consequence. And what I would just really encourage everybody to think about is how is the person who's being affected by whatever that behavior is going to feel if you don't do something, right? Like, try as much as you can to evaluate what the potential consequences of your inaction are. And that's a lot harder. It's so much more salient what the consequences of an action are, but they're both.
But I would argue too that if something's happening in front of you that makes you uncomfortable, you want to take into account what the person that it's happening to is experiencing. But if something's wrong and you know it's wrong, it's wrong. And so yes, you want to watch out for the person that you're instructing the behavior going towards. But the fact is that even if your best friend is totally fine with what's going on, but you are at risk because it makes the place less safe, you have a right to say, that makes it less safe for me. And now that's tricky, and you still, of course, are worried about what your friend thinks, because everybody is. But there's what's the individual experience, and then there's what's wrong. And just because I'm comfortable with someone looking down my shirt, say, but it means that you're now vulnerable, that he's going to do it to you next, you have a right to say, that's not okay with me. I don't know if that's clear, and that's a little bit dangerous, but if it's wrong.
It's not all clear. I mean, that's why we're having this conversation. Again, I love the gray area. I'm ambidextrous, so you know what I'm saying? So like, yeah, it's okay. It's okay if we're there. We're not necessarily going to get answers here. We're talking. I think Red Pants and Black Shirt was next. What is your name? Peter. I think Peter was next, and then it was red shirt. Gentleman in the back with the red shirt. Mark.
Oh no, it's a red shirt.
Can I add in a couple of people before we come up to the front? Okay, and then we'll do Jen and Ash, right? You just have a link? Okay. Okay, so Peter, Mark, and Jen, and then up front.
I don't want to make this a sidetrack or an explosion of the topic, but somebody said something about professionalism. And I feel like there's a huge landmine there that's really important. Like, there's a call in a business environment to be professional. And that means, like, you don't have feelings. And you don't, if something upsets you, like, there's just no way to deal with that unless you go through side channels and, like, you're talking to your friends. And if your friend is, like, the boss, then maybe something gets done about it. And my impression is that that becomes then a way to oppress groups, right? Like if because you have to go around what the rules are, people who are privileged are just allowed to go around the rules, and people who aren't privileged, that gets shut down, right? Why did you go around the normal channels even though normal channels aren't effective? And I wonder if there's a constructive way to think about how we build our business environments so that that's built in, that it's okay to have feelings and say, like, this made me really uncomfortable on that call, and just have that be a thing that you can talk about.
Yeah, I think I really like this point. I think something that's happening in there is you're sort of asking, how do we define professionalism, and who defines professionalism, and who does that definition serve? Who is that definition made for? And if you're going to put a bunch of holes in the definition by only making it apply to certain people, it undermines the core strength of having a request for professionalism at all.
I think it's also important to note, and this is more of a language thing here, when you say being professional means having no feelings traditionally, right? You know what feelings are traditionally aligned with? Women.
Yeah, so it would be one of those, like, word association things.
Yeah.
Like right there, professionalism, men, feelings, women. I mean, I'm just making that.
So I think you're totally accurate in when you say maybe it's time to rework this business model, because we have this idea, the customer is always right kind of thing. And yes, when they're talking about what they want, absolutely they're right. When they're talking to me, whether I'm serving you coffee or building you a website, and they're talking to me like I'm not a human, no.
And one further point, we made a big deal about having a code of conduct at this conference because lots of other tech conferences in the past have failed or half-assed, sorry for the cursing, the code of conduct. A code of conduct is a first step in codifying a different kind of environment by putting down on paper an agreement that we're not going to tolerate certain behavior. Now, if you don't enforce it, it's useless, but businesses can build not only a code of conduct, but enforcement of that code of conduct and conversations around that code of conduct. And I think, Julia is head of HR, and I think that's, I don't mean to speak for you, but I think that that's one thing that you are trying to do.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
Mark.
So in my personal context for this conversation, I think I've been hearing for 40 years. My mother was the third female airline pilot in the United States to work for a major airline, and the first at United Airlines. And, so I've been hearing this conversation for a long time, which makes me feel like we are not having a conversation about something that's endemic in tech. We're having a conversation that's endemic in any male-dominated, traditionally male-dominated profession. Which kind of goes back to my original kind of disappointment that we're not discussing the larger macro things that can be encouraged to get more young girls into tech and into programming, into development. Because the one thing that might cure this, as it does in professions like social work, is more women. I have a degree in social work. I think I can say that's a woman-dominated profession. And you don't have these conversations there about how people interact in the workplace, because it doesn't happen. People are generally much more sensitive to these types of things. And I think it's the presence of women that solves a lot of these problems, which is not to say that anything that's been said here is invalid or anybody's feelings are inappropriate. I think these are all huge concerns about how men act, and point to that we really haven't reached a egalitarian society that we need to. But just saying this is a tech problem and pointing it here, I think is limiting and problematic.
We acknowledge that this is not solely a tech problem.
No, we are not trying to say that.
I'm not saying you are.
So this topic is so flippin' enormous that we had to focus on something that was relevant to our own experience so we could speak as professionals who've experienced these things, and also talk about concrete things that happen in our tech workplace. This is a huge issue, and there's so many dimensions to it, and there's so many ways to address it. There's a lot of stuff out there right now about getting women and girls involved in STEM and like changing girls' education and culture of girls to like be to make change down the road. But what we wanted to talk about is those little places that we can just start to notice and shift things in our own organizations and companies. And we're just focusing there because we can't cover this whole topic. And we're not from Girls Who Code. We're from the places we're from, and these are real experiences that we're having. So that's why we're coming at it from this perspective. But yes, much bigger issue.
I'd like to piggyback on that too, that I'm not really sure it's going to matter how many girls we get interested in STEM if the environment that they're about to enter still is completely unwelcoming to them and has a cultural undercurrent that doesn't really work for a lot of different types of people who aren't young, single, white male.
Part of that change has to occur with the presence of women, and we've kind of a chicken.
And part of the change also has to occur in changing where we're at now. Like, I forget who said it, but someone said that making adjustments after you've built something is a lot harder than working to do it now. We're making adjustments to something that's already built. We're gonna have to chip away at this, and it always starts with you in the immediate presence and what you can do to not participate in things that you don't agree with.
And when we say you, we're not saying you men, we're saying all of us, like me as well.
It starts with you as an individual, starts with anyone out there as an individual.
I think both of these things are very intertwined.
I have no interest in home ec. And if I could afford a full-time live-in maid, I would have her cooking. I'm a terrible cook.
Or him cooking.
or him or her cooking.
Or him. My brother enjoyed cooking, so I let him do all the cooking. And I did all the electronic stuff. I've lived my life living in a man's area. I grew up. I can remember walking into the first OEM meeting I ever went to and being harassed because I was the only woman in a room of 200 men. The only great thing I found about it was I had no waiting in line to go to the ladies' room. There was only 2 secretaries there. There were 4 spots to go use the bathroom. This has been going on both of our lives, and a lot of other women who have gray hair here who covered it up or anything. You're not saying anything new. You're not saying anything new that wasn't said by our great-grandmothers who were wearing bloomers.
Yeah, I don't think we're saying anything new at all, and that's really frustrating. I think we've made a lot of progress, and I think that we're trying to I think the fact that you were the only woman in an electronics class, and now there might be 3 women in an electronics class, at least, with 47 other men, is progress. And
Yeah, the fact that there's 5 women up here speaking to this very gender diverse group that we have in here.
Awesome.
Huge. I mean, the fact that it still needs to be said, of course, sucks.
Because men have to be involved in the question and the answer.
That's why there's men here.
But I'm getting to
They're here, not there.
Maybe they're not saying something new, but I'm hearing it.
Yeah, we're talking to our peers and our colleagues
And
here.
a lot of these people weren't around then either.
Until you get a man up there saying it.
Why does it have to
You're
be?
just going to be the same thing.
You know why I'm up here? Do you know why I'm up here? I'll tell you why I'm up here. Because my husband, who's sitting over there, does 60% of the childcare in my household and 100% of the cooking.
Very good.
And you know what? I'm not trying to brag, although I kind of am, but he is the partner that I dreamed of, and we've been together for 15 years, and that's why I'm here, because a man helped me get here. So there is a man up here. He's behind me.
So are all the other men who've supported us too.
How can we get it across to all men until more men stand up there?
It's just sad that men are the ones, what you're saying is that men won't listen to anyone but men, and that's what we're trying to change. Men shouldn't have to only listen to men. It's kind of ridiculous that when we're talking about women's issues, men are the only voices that are going to be heard. So
it's not so much that men are the ones voices. We say this every time, and we finally get a man to do something. And then it goes back to what it was before, and then we say it again, and then we get a couple of men. Am I not right?
No, you're right.
And then we say it again, and it's going to keep saying it. It's almost like Spengler's theory of history is repeating itself in the women's movement.
Men can be retrained.
Yes. It's getting them to not have to be retrained.
Some I need to
It
train.
hasn't changed in the classroom, in the home at the very beginning.
Yeah, we're running really short on time. Can I have a final show of hands? Last call for comments. If you want to say anything, I'm just gonna put everybody in order. So just put your hand up and I'm gonna count. Awesome. Okay, I already made eye contact with Victoria and I told her she could go, followed by your name? Joanne. Okay, Victoria, Joanne, and then let's go Sharon, Rick, right? Damien, name in the back? Tina, name? Carl, and Connie. And I really hope that you remember who went before you in that list, because now I'm just gonna say go.
So I just wanted to kind of summarize everything that's been said, from the perspective I have as a SMIT student. I have an extraordinary opportunity because I'm at a school where I'm in a classroom with a bunch of women and we learn to present to each other. And I've learned that we can have just as much voice as men, but we won't until we support each other. And that's why there are 5 women up in the front of the room, because there's a panel of 5 women who have male backing, but who have come together to present a view that is frequently unheard and to broach the issue that only they can really understand. Second, I wanted to briefly and calmly address the issue of the pipeline and why it is just as important to change the workforce environment. From Ash's talk, we know that 56% of women who are in the tech field will leave. So yes, we need to increase participation from women because 20 or 30% of the tech field is held by women. So obviously that needs to be fixed. But we also need to fix the fact that 56% are leaving.
Yeah.
So,
Who's next?
I'm next. I want to thank you guys for this panel. I remember we talked about the women in IT getting together as a group. It's a really difficult subject. There's so many things I'd love to say. I got a lot from it. I hope we can continue to support. I know this because when you said, Nicole, about that, what are we going to do to teach calculus to a college student? I'm thinking, can we do that? I mean, because what about sort of that group that's sort of a little late? You can't go back in time.
The Women's Coding Collective, we deal with an adult continuing education audience. I am not saying that's impossible. I'm just saying we should start early.
Together, I appreciate your, respect your degrees and status and all that stuff. And love to hear more about what you're doing. But I just want to thank you. And, I contribute a few stories that I'm not going to because of time. But I have learned that I do have a voice and I can use it. And it has taken some time. And I do also appreciate that sort of what you said before about, sort of like a weighing it out. You know what I mean? What do I do here? One really quick story is somebody used the word gals with me recently, and it was in an email, and then it was verbally, and it's first, I worked with them, and it kind of threw me, and I thought it was really odd, so I actually did say something, and his face turned really red. But, and I apologize for embarrassing him, but I just it's just an odd word. I said, Google it, you'll see. Because I think if you Google it, you'll probably come up with what I'm
all sorts of weird stuff. Yeah.
So it was good to sort of say it, and it felt good. It felt good not to be angry when I said it, but to say it because it seemed important to me.
Yeah.
And plus I didn't want it to continue. Right. It needed to stop. But thank you all for your panel, and I hope we can do it again somehow, somewhere.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Who's next?
I think Sharon's next.
I couldn't remember. I'm glad you did.
I think.
Yeah, I have so many things to say, but gosh, I do appreciate the panel, and I appreciate everybody who participated in the discussion. And I just wanted to say something about diversity in general, and I think that's an important place for us to look at this community, because this community actually, we're all pretty elite in certain ways. We all kind of have a lot of background, but we have a lot of strengths that a lot of other people don't have the same experience.
Privilege, yeah. The knapsack of privilege.
And we're like 80% women, but I work in like IT, which has fewer women. But nonetheless, I think you can have like a workplace that's less than optimal without it necessarily being male-dominated. It's because of the fact that this is so implicit throughout, because our feelings about different voices. It's really hard for people to hire sort of out of class now. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. I hope we keep doing this for both gender and ethnicity.
Yeah, and class.
Yeah.
And that's nerds. Those are nerds years 2 and 3. We're gonna kick it up on the, we're a white Western Mass, but there's lots of pockets of people who are not white and who are in 2-year colleges, and there's a whole universe that we wanted to hit and we just couldn't do it in year 1. So, yeah. Rick.
A lot of people have brought up the idea that we're still talking about this, we've been talking about it for years, and I think that's normal, and I think it's good, because it's a learned behavior. Like, it's, for every generation, the next generation is going to have to learn about how the majority has to step into the shoes of the minority, whether it's a woman or a white person stepping into a black person's shoes. So it's just going to be never ending, and we have to learn that in every generation, just like every generation has to learn how to read. There really almost should be a course in school about how to step into the other person's shoes.
Yeah.
We have a lot of different
Empathy
generations
101.
in this group here too.
Yep. Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Who's next?
I think
Damien?
This is a question I hope to get asked during the keynote that ran out of time. Are there any recommendations on how to deal with scenarios where people who don't see the need for improvement in the status quo? For example, they're arguing that, no, you should remove master slave terminology for computer architecture because of negative connotations, or who don't see the need for a code of conduct.
Right.
So do you want us to answer that, or do you want?
Yes, we're out of time.
We're already over. I don't know how I'm.
Yeah, I mean, there's some resources in the slides, and they're gonna get shared somehow.
Yeah, I gotta add the resource.
There's some
slide and then
links.
Put it up online somewhere.
But also just, I would say more conversations like this, as hard as they are, as awkward as they are. Do it anyway. Like, do it anyway. Sorry. I apologize, folks.
And then after Damien, I think was. Okay, gotcha. And then we moved to this side of the room.
And one more thing to worry about. Historically, shifts to a macro level have changed. As men leave a profession, wages start to drop, and we're starting to see this now, what Ash mentioned this morning about the requirement for open source contributions or unpaid internships, that, we're also going to start to see downward pressures on compensation, and, as more and more, come into this profession. Be careful because, your work is valuable and, you're entitled to your pay. But, historically, the trend has not been good. So that's all one last thing to worry about.
Thanks for that. And was there
Blue man? Blue man group of one?
But you get that downward pressure because women's work is not valued. So you're talking about nursing and teachers. So once that became women's work, and social work, once that became women's work, there was the downward pressure on because we don't value work for women. So by fixing the current problems, we're going to be hopefully reversing that trend.
And before Connie with our final comment, I just want to say we have some handouts up here if you want to take them. Do you need, was it urgent? It was urgent.
I want to be as succinct as possible, which is hard for me, but I would like to put a thought in everybody's head. And one of the reasons that Verizon has created the kind of commercial they have, and there's also the very well-known one about, I think it's Verizon, where a woman is telling the benefits, and the guy comes in and says, where's your manager? And she says, I'm the manager. They're clearly having a campaign. And the simplest way to say what's going on is if you watch Mad Men, they're using an ad agency. And the ad agency has demographics that more and more women are investing. That's a place where women are growing. And just as there were the environmentally conscious corporation was able to push some change into some of the major corporations, so can women who invest in companies like Verizon and many others. And if you have a 401k or 403, whatever the nonprofit equivalent is, take some responsibility and look at where your money is going. Because when more women gain a larger stock stake in the corporations, they can then push their agenda much more effectively, because that is what the corporations do.
The demographics and they control everything.
No, I just wanted to thank. Go ahead. Oh yeah. Well, I wanted to invite people to take handouts and tell you what handouts we had. They're from NC WIT, where we got all the stats for our presentation. We have a chart of the stats. We have a handy checklist to help you reduce unconscious bias in job descriptions and the way that you are writing up a job posting to look for candidates. Reducing unconscious bias in letters of recommendation and reducing unconscious bias in hiring processes and selection. Please take them if you are at all interested. They're here for you.